Hey everybody, Mr. Fraser here from NeonMaths. This is the second video that I'm doing on solving linear equations. If you don't know what linear equations, check out my first video. I explain a little bit about what they are in that. Now, in that video, we looked at solving basic linear equations. We looked at what happens when we've got more than one step. We also looked at what happens when we've got unknowns on both sides of the equation. And finally, we looked at what happens when we've got expressions or equations that involve brackets. So when we need to expand brackets before solving. Today, we're basically going to look at what happens when we've got an equation that involves a fraction. Now, this isn't going to be hard. This is the same kind of stuff. We just need to be logical. We need to be careful with our steps. Now, I'm sure you're going to find this video useful. I hope you're going to find this fun.
Push it all the way to the max, wherein the pencil's gotta learn. When you can't think, mine is on fire. Mass fighter, now it's warrior time, so get preparing. Gladiator, mass is the armor that you wear.
Right, let's get started by trying to solve this equation. One of the first things that we need to do when given a question that looks a little bit like this is to get rid of the fractions. We're mathematicians who love fractions, but when we're doing algebra, we secretly pretend to hate them. So we're going to try and get rid of them first of all. So I do that in exactly the same way. Well, what we were talking about earlier with inverse operations. I'm trying to get rid of this divided by 5, so I do that by multiplying both sides by 5. Okay? Divided by 5, multiplied by 5, they undo each other, so I'm left with 2x plus 7. And when I multiply everything on this side by 5, it's important we remember we're multiplying everything by 5. So I'm going to do an additional step here, which I don't expect you'll probably do. But that way I can make sure that I know that I'm multiplying x by 5 and negative 1 by 5. So let's try and simplify this. So this is a great example of a question where if we collect the x's on the side where there are the most x's, we won't have to divide by a negative number. So I can see that on this side of the equation there are 5 x's, on this side of the equation there are 2 x's. So I'm going to collect my x's on the side where there are more x's. So I want to get rid of this plus 2x, so I do the inverse operation. Whatever I do to one side, I must do to the other. I want to keep that equation nicely balanced. That cancels out, leaves me with 7 equals 5x take away 2x is 3x minus 5. I'm going to get rid of this number. I'm going to add 5 to both sides. 12 equals 3x. And my final step to get x by itself, I do the inverse of multiplying. So I divide both sides by 3. Okay, inverse of multiplying is divide. They cancel out and leave me with x equals 12 over 3, which is 4. Please notice, working nicely down the page, showing my work as I go along, being very careful not to make silly mistakes. Sometimes the coefficient of an unknown is a fraction. When solving equations that have fractions in them, one of the first things that you should try and do is get rid of the fraction. Now, there are a few different ways of doing this, but I'm going to show you one of those ways. In this case, we can get rid of this fraction by multiplying both sides of the equation by a number. Remember, whatever we do to one side, we must do to the other side. The best number to multiply both of those expressions by is whatever is on the denominator of our fraction. So in this case, we're going to multiply everything on the left-hand side by 4 and everything on the right-hand side by 4. Okay, so what happens when we expand these brackets? Well, this might cause a little bit of confusion. And I suggest if you ever get a question like this and you can't really remember what to do, it might be a good idea to write it just by itself. So I'm going to use this space over here. So we're doing 4 multiplied by 3/4. Well, I could write that as 4 over 1 times 3 over 4. And we know that when we multiply fractions, we multiply the numerators together, multiply the denominators together. So I've got 12 over 4, which equals 3. Okay, so 4 multiplied by 3/4 is 3x. 4 multiplied by minus 5, positive and negative, minus 20 equals 36 minus 4x. Now all we need to do is collect all the unknowns on one side, all the constants on the other. So I'm looking, where are there more x's? Well, there's 3 x's here. There's less than no x's here. There's negative 4 x's. So I want to collect all of my x's on this side of the equation and all my unknowns on the other side of the equation. And finally, all I need to do to solve for x is, well, this means 7 multiplied by x, so do the inverse of multiplying by 7. So I divide both sides by 7, and that gives me x equals 8. So what happens when we have an equation that has 2 coefficients that are fractions, I hear you ask? Well, that's a great question. And here you are. Well, how do we remove these fractions? We don't like the fractions. We want to get rid of them to start with. Now, the best way of doing that is by multiplying everything by the lowest common denominator of, well, these 2 fractions. Well, it's 6. So I'm going to multiply everything on the left-hand side by 6 and everything on the right-hand side by 6. Great. Now let's expand the brackets. So 6 multiplied by 2/3. Remember, we had an example, but this is the same as 6 over 1 multiplied by 2 over 3. So 6 times 2 is 12 over 3x equals 6 times, well, that'll just become 6 over 2. 6 times a half, well, that's the same as 6 halves of x plus 6. Can I simplify this? Of course I can. If I can't, then I've made a mistake. Remember, I'm trying to get rid of those fractions. So 12 divided by 3 is 4x equals 6 divided by 2 is 3. And the rest is exactly the same. So that's it. That's how we do it if we've got 2 expressions that have fractions as coefficients. Multiply everything by the lowest common multiple of their denominators. So this is the last question that we're going to do in this session on solving equations that involve algebraic fractions. Now, algebraic fractions do get a lot harder than this. We do need to be able to simplify algebraic fractions. We're going to do that. We're going to look at that, so keep an eye out for that video. But for now, this is the last question that we're going to do. Now, I'm going to do this the long way, and then I'm going to show you a little trick that'll help you when we've got a fraction that equals another fraction. Okay, now this is kind of similar to one of the questions that we did earlier. Again, we want to get rid of the denominator of the fraction. So the first thing I'm going to do is multiply both sides by the denominator. So in this case, let's multiply both sides by 4. Well, 4 divided by 4 multiplied by 4 cancel each other out, so it just leaves us with 5x minus 3 on this side of the equation. And on the other side of the equation, well, we need to multiply it all by 4, so we're going to be left with 4 multiplied by 2x minus 1 over 3. Now to get rid of this, I'm going to multiply both sides by 3. And that'll leave us with Now this is a very important step. We can actually skip straight to this step. We can avoid doing these 2 kind of steps along here if we know that we can do something that's often referred to as cross multiplying. It only works when we have a fraction that equals another fraction. If there are other numbers involved, if it was like 1 plus this, wouldn't be able to do it. But in this case, we have just a fraction that equals another fraction, so we can cross multiply. We can multiply the denominator of this fraction by the numerator of this fraction to get 3 multiplied by 5x minus 3, and the denominator of this fraction by the numerator of this fraction. So we've got 4 multiplied by 2x minus 1. Remember that, that's a really nifty little trick. So all we need to do now is expand, simplify, and solve the equation. So from here, after all the practice that we've done, I'm going to be super good at this. Anyway, let's do it. Right, and that's it. Brilliant. Guys, solving equations are great fun, okay? They do take a little bit of practice. Very easy to get into the rhythm, but you do need to practice these. So that's it, guys. That is how you solve linear equations. I hope you found it useful. In the future, we're going to look at solving more complicated equations. We're going to specifically be looking at solving quadratic equations, what we need to do, and all the different kinds of ways that we can go about that. Remember, algebra is easy when you know how, but it does take practice. I hope you found this useful. Please subscribe to my video. This is NeonMaths.